I want to thank while we're getting my slides up, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. So what I'd like to do is talk a bit about one slice of this evidence to policy pipeline, and that is the slice that's around the summary and description of the evidence that's available. And I want to use two examples from education. One is the What Works Clearinghouse here in the U.S., and the second is a large-scale meta-analysis recently published that summarizes the results of 191 randomized controlled trials on mathematics interventions for kindergarten to 12th grade students. So a little bit about, just in case you don't know what What Works Clearinghouse is. It was established in 2002 by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is the funding research arm of the U.S. Department of Education. And it's meant to be a place where education decision makers, like literally district superintendents, principals, teachers, can go to find trusted information about what educational interventions actually work. Okay, and so, how does I'm going to put this down. How does the What Works Clearinghouse approach this task? Well, they focus on individual studies and rating the quality of individual studies, and their rating system goes meets without reservation, meets with reservation, or does not meet. Okay. And since 2002, the What Works Clearinghouse has worked very hard to make these standards and guidelines transparent. And in fact, the world of educational researchers knows very well what these standards are. And if you are working on a new educational intervention, you are certain to design an impact evaluation or an efficacy trial that uses those What Works Clearinghouse standards. So these are transparent and clear to everyone in the educational research field. And so what does the What Works Clearinghouse value? Well, they value well-conducted randomized controlled trials because they're interested in the question, what works? And so they really are looking and valuing studies that can support a strong causal inference. Okay. And so just as an example, this is just one flow chart from the What Works Clearinghouse manual of how to evaluate individual studies of individual interventions. And you can see here, this is about a randomized trial with the randomization at the level of the student, at the individual level. And they highly value no baseline equivalence and low attrition and so forth. And again, these standards are well known in the educational research field. So what has happened? What has been the result of sort of the What Works Clearinghouse approach to evidence in this way? So it turns out, I don't think it's a surprise to anyone, that it's super hard to do a well-controlled randomized trial in education for a variety of reasons. Obviously, the context of schools and schooling, the resources available, and so forth. So in the What Works Clearinghouse database, for any given educational intervention, there are only a handful of studies, only a very few studies that would be eligible to be reviewed, and even fewer still that would meet the What Works Clearinghouse standards without reservation. So what does that mean about the kind of evidence we have about any given individual intervention? Well, it means we only have a few studies. So what we might have a very good estimate of whether or not that intervention works, but we only know how it works in the contexts that are reflected in those 3 studies. The last time I checked, there was a median number of 3 studies per intervention in the What Works Clearinghouse database. But even given that, I think I can't discount, and I shouldn't discount, the profound impact that these standards have actually had the transparency of these standards and the understanding of these standards, the impact it's really had on increasing the quality of the funded trials in education for interventions. So it has raised the bar of large scale randomized trials in education that are funded by, for example, the Institute for Education Sciences. But let me contrast that with a sort of another approach. And this is from a recently published meta-analysis that looks at the results of 191 randomized trials of mathematics interventions for kindergarten to 12th grade students. So this sort of approach to summarizing evidence is taking a little bit of different tact than the What Works Clearinghouse. Here, the idea was to actually understand the variation in treatment effects. What is the potential range of effectiveness of mathematics interventions? How do they differ by different contexts with different students and so forth? So transparency is still there. This is a high quality meta-analysis. The methods are clearly stated in the published paper. They have a code book available with the published paper, but importantly, and consistent with the values that we all share in this room, the data is freely available, as is the analysis script. Okay, and I'll show you sort of how they present this sort of idea. This is a screenshot from an app that they built, the authors built for this particular study. And I don't want to, go into great detail here, but what you can see, each dot is an effect size from one of these 191 randomized trials. And what they are really trying to look at is the range of treatment effects that are possible across all the contexts and students and content areas that are represented in these 191 trials. And you can see up at the left corner there, that you can actually drill down on this data set and look at what are the range of effects for, say, elementary school students, or for interventions that are focused on geometry and so forth. So the idea is to move beyond the what if it works, or the question of what works, to what works in what context for what people. Okay. Okay, oops. So in this approach, we are sort of at a 30,000 foot level. Where is the evidence? What does it, it gives us a sense of where the evidence is, where the evidence isn't. It doesn't give us as much information about any given intervention, but we do know sort of about the range of interventions, what the range of intervention effects are, what they could possibly be in a larger variety of contexts, which is in contrast to the What Works Clearinghouse. So whereas this particular meta-analysis gets at that question of what works in what contexts and for what students, the What Works Clearinghouse is really more interested and focuses very strongly on whether or not something works. Okay. So to kind of go back to what the point of this panel was to talk about transparency. So in reflecting on sort of this context that I've given you, I think obviously transparency is necessary but not sufficient when we're thinking about moving evidence to policy, to actual change in policy. We have to have transparency so that we have credibility of our findings. But the question of how to move that to changing behavior, changing policy is still an open question, and how transparency fits into that is something that that in my world of meta-analysis I'm not an expert. I think that's, yeah. So I think really our challenge then too is to think about, well, how do we translate these findings and these transparently summarized and presented findings into into products or in ways of actually moving policy. So hopefully Ruth can tell us that.